Good morning. My name is Felicia Orth. I'm a hearing officer appointed by the Environmental Improvement Board to conduct a hearing in EIB 21-27. This is a rulemaking for ozone precursors. We are on day 4 of the hearing, and we begin with public comment.
Madam Hearing Officer, we cannot hear you. At least I cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Member Garcia, can you hear me? And Member Bitzer can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Mr. Boutsier, I believe the problem is with your own system. Let's see. We begin each day of the hearing at 9 with public comment. Public comment is also taken at 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. each day of the hearing. I have 2 folks who reached out to the board's administrator, Pam Jones, with a request to offer public comment this morning by email. That is Paul Gessing and Han Nguyen. And I'll call on you in just a moment. In the event you're on the platform and have not yet reached out by email, I'm still happy to accept your comment this morning. Simply reach out through the chat. Chat is enabled for everyone. Public comment is taken by audio, not video, is taken under oath, and is limited to 5 minutes. So with that, let me find Mr. Gessing first. Here's Mr. Gessing. Mr. Gessing, I'm unmuting you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, your voice is coming through loud and clear. Thank you. Would you please spell your first and last name?
Yes, my name is Paul, Paul. Last name Gessing, Gessing.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Okay. My name is Paul Gessing. I run Rio Grande Foundation, which is a public research nonprofit based in Albuquerque dealing with New Mexico public policy issues. The Rio Grande Foundation is concerned about the proposed methane rule. We have serious concerns about language that eliminates threshold, the marginal well opportunities for oil and gas production in New Mexico. As we all know, New Mexico is among the most reliant states in the entire country on oil and gas, and that includes everybody in our fair state. We just want to make sure that this process is collaborative with the industry and does not unduly harm production of oil and gas in the state of New Mexico. The state is becoming more reliant on oil and gas, not less, and we also need the revenue that it generates. We need the jobs that it generates, and we have been proactive as a state in reducing pollution across the entire economy. That doesn't mean that we have to do everything all at once. And I urge the EIB and other policymakers to be judicious and collaborative. The industry has no interest in waste. They've improved dramatically in recent years their practices in both major basins across New Mexico in limiting and reducing the amount of waste and venting and flaring. And I just want to make sure this is a collaborative, not a punitive process imposed on the industry. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gessing. I have a question from Larry Sontag about not being able to see other attendees. or non-panel speakers, that is a function of the Cisco WebEx event settings, Mr. Sontag. Let's see, the other person reaching out by email to offer comment this morning was Han Guillen. Mr. Guillen, I'm going to unmute you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Would you spell your first and last name, please?
My first name H-A-N-H, Hang. Last name Nguyen, N-G-U-Y-E-N, Nguyen.
Thank you, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name.
That's all right.
So if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. I'm going to start your 5 minutes now.
Okay. This is Hang Nguyen in Albuquerque. I appreciate the Environmental Improvement Board for the opportunity to provide comment on ozone hearing day 4. Communities of color face disproportionate impact from climate change and air pollution in Lee, Eddy, and San Juan counties. There are more than 130,000 New Mexicans live within a half mile of oil and gas development. People say I live in Bernalillo County, far from oil and gas production plants. Why should I care? This is a health equity issue. Everyone should care. Leak due to equipment malfunction and lack of maintenance account for 70% of the oil and gas industry's emissions statewide. Here in New Mexico, oil and gas operations release more than 1 million metric tons of methane every year. That has the same short-term climate impacts as 22 coal-fired power plants or 28 million automobiles. I suggest the 3 critical improvements that the EIB should make to protect communities and address major sources of pollution. 1. Strengthen a requirement to cut pollution from pneumatic controllers that are used in oil and gas production. The devices that are the second largest source of oil and gas methane emissions in New Mexico. An MED should require companies to inspect pneumatics for leaks and accelerate timeline to retrofit equipment with zero bleed or zero emission pneumatic controllers. 2. Protect those living closest to the development by requiring more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks. 3. Ensure strong requirements for operators to control pollution during the completion of an oil or gas well, as well as when they redevelop an existing well. This is health equity for children and elderly as well as community of color. These actions will alleviate the burden of diseases associated with pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have anyone else reaching out through the chat to offer public comment this morning. So we will return to the technical case. This morning, we will begin with 2 witnesses that we needed to loop back to, including Dr. Thompson. Before we turn to the technical witnesses this morning, I believe Ms. Katz, you had a proposal. Can you join us on screen?
Good morning, Madam Hearing Officer and members of the board. I had just a suggestion regarding how to maybe streamline the process for asking the parties after they, if they have questions for a witness, cross-examination questions. And I had suggested an approach whereby the hearing officer could call on the specific parties that had submitted direct or rebuttal testimony to ask if they had questions, and then other parties could indicate in the chat if they wished to cross-examine the witnesses. But Madam Hearing Officer, you suggested another way, which would be to simply have the people who wanted to cross-examine just start their video and appear on screen, and that seems like an even better way to do that. So.
Right. Thank you. It occurred to me yesterday for some reason. We are all making our way through an unusual landscape on a virtual platform. And in an ordinary hearing, I was thinking, how would a lawyer indicate they wish to cross-examine? Typically, they just stand up, and I could see them standing up, or even beginning to stand up. So let me ask if there are any other council or party representatives on the platform who have a comment on this. Mr. Heiser?
Madam Hearing Officer, I think that either the approaches that you or Ms. Katz have spoken about by putting yourself on the video would work. I guess I would just ask for a little bit of consideration that sometimes we fumble the little buttons at the bottom of the screen. So as long as there's some allowance for delay while that occurs, I think that'd be really a way to expedite without having to go through the long roll call for each and every witness on every issue. Thank you.
All right. I get so much practice with names then, though. Mr. DeSalen, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I just wanted to say that I prefer, well, I appreciate Ms. Katz's suggestion. I prefer your approach of using the starting the video, because that's pretty quick, simple, and doesn't need people looking at the chat.
All right, thank you. Thank you all then. I will do that, and I will take a nice long pause to allow you to start your video. Now in the chat, I see that Sister Rosemary Cicchini would like to make public comment. So excuse me while I go, oh, wait, I see Mr. Boutsier.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. You've already decided to do what Charlie DeSalen recommended, and that is something I support. I also have another efficiency suggestion, which is that perhaps the hearing officer could give each party the option to go into their rebuttal at the same time that they go into their direct and rebuttal testimony, hopefully avoiding the sort of snaking effect of what we originally outlined. I think that might make more sense, be more efficient, would still allow NMED to be the final word.
Thank you for that, Mr. Boutsier. I agree. Certainly yesterday it became apparent that would be expeditious when we had a witness in those circumstances. And again, so long as NMED gets to present its final opinion on all the other parties' proposals, I think that would work. Ms. Katz, is that something you agree with?
Yes, absolutely, Madam Hearing Officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you very much. So let me go back to public comment for just a moment. Sister Cicchini, I'm sorry I didn't realize you wanted to offer public comment, but I'm unmuting you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Good morning, members of the board and hearing officer. I'm Rosemary Cicchini, Marginal sister.
Hold on one
Yes.
second. Would you please spell your name?
Yes. First name, Rosemary, Rosemary, Cicchini, Ceccchini.
Thank you. And if you would raise your right hand, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. I'll start your 5 minutes now.
Thank you. And good morning, members of the board and hearing officer. As I have stated, I'm a Marginal sister, director of the Office of Life, Peace, Justice, and Creation with Catholic Charities of Gallup Diocese. And I'm offering these comments on behalf of concerned people of faith in frontline communities that we are serving in northeastern New Mexico who are disproportionately impacted by the oil and gas operations in the San Juan Basin. These are causing serious health and environmental impacts, threats to children, the elderly, Native Americans, and those living in poor rural communities. In fact, almost half of all Native Americans in San Juan County, about 22,000 people, live within a half-mile of a well site. In my visits, local people have described the adverse health and environmental impacts they continue to experience and suffer from due to the unregulated oil and gas operations that continually emit methane gas through venting, flaring, leaks, and associated toxic air pollution. This unregulated methane release is a powerful climate change accelerator, 84 times more polluting than carbon dioxide and responsible for 25% of the warming we are now experiencing. And we have all witnessed what the threats of climate crisis hold out before us. Our faith traditions teach that creation is God-given and sacred, intended for the well-being and flourishing of all human and planetary life. Clean air in the atmosphere is a sacred commons, providing oxygen and breath for all living beings. In gratitude and love for all our neighbors, including humans, creatures of all species, tree and plant life, the natural environment, we urge the Environment Department to adopt strong methane rules, which include the following improvements. Protect those living closest to development by requiring more frequent inspections to find and fix leaks. Ensure strong requirements for operators to control pollution during the completion of an oil or gas well or when they redevelop an existing well. Strengthen requirements to cut pollution from pneumatic controllers that are used in oil and gas production. These devices are the second largest source of oil and gas methane emissions in New Mexico. And MED should require companies to inspect pneumatics for leaks and accelerate the timeline to retrofit equipment with zero bleed or zero emission pneumatic controllers. We believe the life of present and future generations depend on your actions. And thank you for the opportunity to offer our comments today.
Thank you very much, Sister Cicchini. Okay, now I don't have any further indication from the chat or email that anyone would like to offer public comment. Our first witness this morning, Ms. Katz.
Madam Hearing Officer, I believe that we had discussed that it would, was it Mr. Smitherman made that Mr. Heiser was going to see if what he wanted to present regarding the small business facility definition?
Right, I think it was Mr. Smitherman first and then Dr. Thompson. I've made both of them panelists. And if you expect to see a witness among the panelists and you don't see them, please look among the attendees. I'm happy to do that. Let's see, Mr. Heiser, will Mr. Smitherman need screen sharing privileges?
I think that would probably be helpful, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. We will do that. Okay. That function is done. Mr. Smitherman, you are still under oath. Mr. Heiser, please go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Smitherman, can you please state your name for the record?
John R. Smitherman.
And have you previously submitted your testimony that you've been given on direct and rebuttal and adopted that in this proceeding?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Did you prepare a summary of your testimony as it relates to the small business exemption that's currently proposed for 20.2.50.125?
Yes, I did.
Regulation. Would you like to give a summary of that? And you're going to cover your rebuttal as well. Is that true?
I think that would be most efficient.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Vice Chair, board members, and Madam Hearing Officer, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today.
And we can't see your slides, John, if you...
I'm just about to try it right now.
Okay. Just
Let's
want
see
to
if
make
this
sure you knew.
works. am I sharing now?
You are.
Good. Let me move this here. Is it still sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I want to offer some comments on the small business facility as well. As we all heard, Mr. Davis yesterday give a very compelling argument and good input about this particular section of the rule. From our perspective, and I represent NMOGA, New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, we recognize that the negative impacts, if you will, the cost impacts, negative impacts of this rule are not contained just to small businesses. Really, every business, every oil and gas operator has both low producing wells and higher producing wells in their inventory. And it's those low producing wells and assets that are going to suffer the compliance cost issues that go with this rule. Businesses make decisions on spending money for anything, including compliance, based on a project basis. If it's a well, it's on a well basis. It's on the economics of that particular facility or that well.
I'm sorry, Mr. Smitherman.
Yes.
Would you please identify the exhibits you'll be referring to for the board members?
I'm going to ask counsel if you'll give them the exhibit numbers, please.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Smitherman's direct testimony is found in NMOGA Exhibit A1, and his rebuttal testimony is found in Exhibit 41. And I apologize for that. And Mr. Smitherman, if you are meaning to be advancing your slides, you are not doing so.
Oh. Did that advance it?
Yes. You're now on the small business facility. This is, I believe, about Dr. McCabe.
Yeah, that's Sir rebuttal. I'm going to change. Let me, I've got a little technical complication here. Let me stop sharing just for a moment and see if I can get the correct, when you got multiple screens and sharing and new technology, sometimes it makes it a little difficult for me. Give me just a moment, please.
Madam Hearing Officer, this is Phoebe again. Can we have Mr. Heiser state again which exhibits? I missed the second. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, Ms. Buena. Sometimes I am guilty of speaking rapidly. It's Exhibit 41 is the rebuttal exhibit.
Thank you.
And Mr. Heiser, the first testimony, you said it was A1 on the list of exhibits we have. There's no A1. We have NMOGA exhibits 1 through 7, 8 through 20, and then.
So, yes, Mr. Honker, it is a little bit confusing. It's in Appendix A of our initial filing, and it is the first exhibit in Appendix A.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, am I now sharing my screen?
You are not. Now you are.
There we go. And am I sharing the screen that says direct and rebuttal testimony?
It says right now direct.pdf at the upper line.
The slide itself, is it the NMOGA logo?
It is the NMOGA logo.
And then says direct and rebuttal
Yes.
near the bottom. Thank you. Perfect. Sorry for that delay. I've already addressed this particular slide. I'm going to move past it. In essence, the concept is if an expenditure is more than a particular well or facility can justify based on its income or future income, then the operator is going to make the rational decision to not spend the money and cease operating that asset. So if a well cannot justify the compliance expenditures that are required for that particular well, and that well is going to be shut in and plugged, and all the benefits that go with that well's production, all of its, as Mr. Davis said, it's premature abandonment is going to, you're going to miss out on the employment of people that continue to work on that property. You're going to miss out on tax revenues, all of the economic activity that comes from that particular well. So it's not a question of whether the company has enough money or enough profits that they can comply with these rules. Those companies are going to make individual project or individual well decisions as to whether or not to spend the money. So this whole company profit concept just really is really a false narrative. So that's why NMOGA is focused on looking at each individual requirement, each of the sections of the rule, to try to, as best we can, right size the compliance requirements and therefore the compliance costs that go with each well, that try to then reduce compliance costs on the lowest volume producing wells so that we don't have to plug as many wells as perhaps we might have to under this original rule. So our change, and we did make a change on the proposed rule, was to strike this section. I will say that it was very difficult for us to get a full understanding of the work that NMED did, and quite frankly, very difficult for us to understand how many operators they had identified that would fit under the small business facility exemption until we heard and read the testimony here in just the last couple of days. We support Independent Producers Association of New Mexico's position and their recommendation. We're also staying ready if the board decides that it's worthy and advisable for this small business facility provision to be included in the rule and perhaps improved. There were many, many valid criticisms of the rule as written yesterday. I think that perhaps if the board decides that it's worthwhile keeping this rule, NMOGA would be very happy to participate in an improvement of that through some kind of a cooperative exchange. Regardless of that, it should not detract from the tailored approach that NMOGA has taken for each one of these rule sections. Thank you. That concludes my summary.
Did you want to touch on your Sir rebuttal, John?
Sure. Let's see if I can do that. That's another challenge, isn't it? I'm thinking I'm going to stop sharing and change and reshare. Perhaps that would work best. Am I sharing the small business facility that begins with Dr. McCabe's name?
Yes, you are.
Lovely. Thank you. This is in response to some rebuttal testimony from Dr. McCabe. And it really is the same narrative that we see kind of over and over, the people who don't understand how businesses work. He says that these companies could afford to comply with the requirements as proposed by the NMED because they're large companies and successful companies. That testimony, as I've just mentioned, just misses the point. It's just not how businesses make decisions. They make decisions on specific projects, and if spending money on a particular project is not supported by the return, if you will, of that particular project or asset, they're simply not going to spend the money, and they're going to abandon that asset and plug and abandon a well, for example. So it's just making prudent business decisions. And if companies make imprudent business decisions, that's not in the best interest of their shareholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smitherman. We have no additional questions of Mr. Smitherman, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heiser and Mr. Smitherman. Council or other party representatives, in the event you have a question of Mr. Smitherman based on this testimony, please turn on your screen. I see Ms. Katz. Ms. Katz.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I just have a few questions for you, Mr. Smitherman. You said that you had a difficult time understanding what we did and how we came up with our data on small business facilities and the facilities that we thought would qualify for that until the past couple days. And so I just wanted to ask you if you read Ms. Day and Ms. Keen's 15 pages of direct testimony explaining all of that, which is the same and in fact more than what they explained yesterday, I believe. So did you review that testimony, which was filed on July 28th, I believe?
I did read it. I don't know that I read it when it first came out. And so perhaps I missed some of the impacts of that early on. It really became much more apparent as I read through their rebuttal testimony and looked back at really kind of what they were describing in their direct. We actually tried, in fact, I personally looked into the spreadsheets myself and perhaps didn't spend enough time on them. Maybe that was the case, but it was difficult to follow with just looking at the spreadsheets themselves.
Okay, thank you. And so, but you do agree that after that direct testimony was filed and the spreadsheet that NMOGA did have a chance to prepare written rebuttal testimony on that as well?
Yes, we had an opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And then would you agree that the department has accepted many of NMOGA's proposed revisions to the various provisions of the rule?
Yes.
As of our most recent red line, I should clarify. In I guess the most recent one that we filed was on September 16th.
Yes, the NMED has accepted much of the input from NMOGA. We've really tried very hard to not be a no, but to be someone in an organization that tries hard to look at the rule and try to find a right balance between the effectiveness of the rules and the impact on the industry and this important industry in New Mexico. So yes, we appreciate the fact that NMED has accepted much of our input. Thank you.
And would you agree that NMED likewise has not been a no in terms of listening to the input that NMOGA provided.
I agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have for Mr.
Certainly.
Smitherman.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Fox, did I see you on screen?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Good morning, Mr. Smitherman.
Good
My
morning,
name
Ms.
is
Fox.
Yeah, nice to see you. A few questions, Mr. Smitherman. You stated in your testimony that I guess not only did NMOGA not put forth alternate language for the definition of small business facility, but NMOGA in its last proposal to the board in Exhibit 47 proposes to strike the small business facility definition, correct?
We did. We saw really what we believed to be a better way to address the impacts on low producing assets by tailoring each of the sections that are applicable to those different equipments that are on those assets. And so rather than try to find a different structure, we stayed the course, if you will, and focused on each individual section.
And so NMOGA didn't supply any data or analysis or economic analysis in support of a small business exemption that would exempt lower producing wells, correct?
No, we focused on those same aspects in the individual sections.
And so, as I understood your testimony today, you're not suggesting that the board adopt right now any other proposal for a small business exemption. What I heard you say is that you're willing to engage in discussions with NMED and presumably other parties about any kind of small business exemption. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. That's all I have, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you, Ms. Fox. I see no other council or party representatives on the screen, so I'll turn to the board in the event they have questions. If you are an attendee and would have a question of Mr. Smitherman, please reach out to me in the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions of Mr. Smitherman?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Yes, I have a couple of questions. I think on one of your slides this morning, you had mentioned that NMOGA represents over 1,000 members, which is equivalent to about 90% of oil and gas production in New Mexico. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that is.
Thank you. And so does NMOGA, in that membership, are there members that would be impacted by this small business discussion? We have a small business facility.
I don't know. When we went through the statistics yesterday, and I think the number was somewhere less than 100 operators that the NMED has identified. I don't know the names of those companies, so I cannot tell you with any certainty whether they're NMOGA members or not. I know that NMOGA does have many small operating company members, so it's very possible that some of those very members some of those very operators are members of NMOGA.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to have I know Ms. Katz had asked you a couple of questions regarding this, but I just want to make sure I understand. So now that you've heard more testimony and information by NMED regarding what would be a small business facility, do you have a full you said there was about less than 100 operators. I guess there's no, I guess other than that's what you understand as those being impacted. by the small business facility language within the proposed rules. Is that correct? Sorry if I made that a little bit confusing. I just want to verify that that is your current understanding after the discussions over the last few days, and that no other analysis has been done by yourself regarding who or what companies that will impact the numbers.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And I apologize if I made that a little bit confusing. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Smitherman.
Good morning. Could you give me just one moment? There's someone making a lot of noise just outside my door. I need to take just a moment.
Yes, no problem.
I'm very sorry about that. I could barely hear you.
No problem. I hope you can hear me okay now.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, now that we've had a good night's rest, I had some time to think of a couple more questions, and I'm hoping you can answer these. They kind of came up yesterday in our talk with Mr. Davis. We were talking about the small businesses, and I'm trying to kind of pull this image together for myself, but and stripper wells. So we were discussing payoff over a time for these wells, and I'm curious, when you're looking at the economics on a well by well basis, what's the time frame you look at for a stripper well? Because as I understand it, they're low producing wells. They may be towards the end of their life. So what's the payoff time for any sort of investment on a well like that?
Well, it does make a difference. The character, the production of the well makes a difference. For example, I know that there's many low rate producing wells, gas wells in the state. They may be more concentrated in the Northwest. And those wells may have a low rate production that could go for many years with very little decline. You also may have a low rate producing well that has a decline to it that it, quite frankly, may just have a few more years of life left. So first you'd have to look at that to see, is it really worth it? And if for example, you were going to spend money and you were not going to get payback in the first year, you spend money and basically you've spent in the entire amount of profit that asset was going to give you for a full year. That makes it very difficult to want to spend that money. Certainly, if it was going to be longer than that, you'd have to think not only twice, but maybe 3 times as to whether it's a worthwhile expenditure. Don't forget also that if you make the commitment to spend the money for compliance and you think you are going to get a payout of that, payback of that, not a payout, but a payback of that within a year, other things can happen to that well that maybe you needed to spend additional money for repair or some other type of unexpected maintenance on that well, and that pushes your payback of the compliance cost even further. So it really makes it very difficult to give you just a, kind of a stock answer to that. But you can see it is getting beyond, certainly beyond a year's worth of income, net income after operating expenses, makes it very difficult for an operator to make that commitment.
So I'm gathering that the newer the well, the higher the producer, it's easier to make an upfront investment for compliance because it's got a longer payout time, but a stripper well or marginal well would have a shorter pay. You'd want it to pay back shorter because the well could be plugged in the near future or may not be pay for itself.
Let's look at it a little differently than that. If you've got a well that's a moderately high rate producer, that well is going to make quite a bit of money in a year. And your compliance cost could be something that could pay out within a few weeks if you get a really, really good producer. Well, that makes a good business decision. I've got two choices. I either don't pay the money for compliance and plug the well, or I spend the money for compliance and get to continue producing the well. So if I were able to spend money on a well and I get paid back within a month, then the rest of the time, the rest of the life of that well is additional income that I get to have. That makes that's a good business decision to go ahead and forego, in essence, spend the income that I might have expected from that well from 1 month to be able to get the income for the rest of the life of that well. That's a great decision. When I look at a well that I have to spend the same compliance money perhaps, and it takes a year, maybe longer, to be able to pay me back for that compliance cost, it really becomes much, much more difficult to say, I'm willing to do that. And let's take that to the next level. If your company maybe has quite a few of those wells that need compliance expenditures that are low rate producers, your whole company's income may be dedicated to spendings that are associated with compliance. You may spend the entire income of your company on compliance costs. So what are you going to do with your employees? You still have to pay them. What are you going to do with all the other things that keep your business running? The smaller businesses do have a tougher challenge when they have maybe a larger percentage of their well inventory are low rate producers. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And thank you for clarifying that for me. Generally, when just based on some comments from Mr. Davis yesterday, when a well is reaching that marginal status or stripper well status, what's the life of that well look like? Do larger companies sell off those assets? Do they tend to be bought up by small companies? Or because he was discussing early abandonment. So if a company decided not to put that investment into compliance or decided that that well wasn't worth continuing to operate, would they try to sell it off or would they plug it themselves?
Well, they may try, but the problem doesn't go away because the decision that the first owner has as to whether to spend the compliance dollars on that well, when they know that the well can't pay that back for some long period of time, that problem goes to the next owner should someone buy it. In fact, it's actually worse because now that next buyer has spent money on that property. They would normally expect the income of that property to pay them back for the purchase. But then not only have they spent money for the well itself, but now they have the choice, decision as to whether to spend the compliance dollars. So for them, they've not only got to get payback of the compliance dollars, they then have to get payback of their purchase price. So they may try, the first owner may try to sell that property, but it's likely not going to be bought by anyone because they know that that new owner is going to have to do the same thing.
Thank you for kind of helping me draw some of these pieces together. I appreciate you answering my questions.
Certainly. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Member Cates, do you have questions?
Yeah, thanks for testifying today, sir. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, um, perhaps your major concern is the effect on on stripper wells. Is that correct?
It is. I'm going to not necessarily agree with the term stripper well because sometimes people have a particular definition for that.
Okay.
I'll just call them low rate producers for now.
And so that's your major concern. And this has probably been covered in testimony, I just don't remember, but um, can you tell us how many stripper wells there are potentially affected by this? How many owners there are, and what percentage of the production in the state comes from stripper wells?
I don't have those statistics in my head or in front of me, but I'll characterize it if you wouldn't mind. There are a lot of low volume producers in the state. And Namoga has taken the position that in essence, no well, regardless of its production rate, is immune from the impacts of this rule. In fact, if you look at particularly at the LDAR section, every well in the state must be subject to LDAR under either the NMED's currently offered rules or Namoga's red lines. So there are a lot of low producing wells. And
Okay, so
go ahead. I'm sorry.
You said there are a lot of low producing wells, but you don't have the specific number. I'm just trying to get a handle on how, how much of the industry is comprised of low producing wells that will be affected by this. Because there's no metric we could put on that.
Actually, I think Mr. Davis gave some statistics yesterday on stripper wells as defined. I think he gave a definition for stripper well and gave you some statistics on that. So perhaps that would be a better place to look.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Member Bitzer?
Thank you. Does closing a well sooner than you otherwise would have potentially increase the odds that you will end up, say, under changed market, economic, or technological circumstances, going back out to that area and reopening it up again later?
It is certainly possible. I've seen this in my career where we had a well or wells that had reached the end of their profitable economic life in our perception of it at the time. And so we closed the well in and then later either recognized a different formation opportunity in the well that we could re-enter and open up that new zone, or perhaps the economics changed. Perhaps product prices had changed to the point that you could make profit from the well. So that does change. I think that can be a little overstated. because many times when you've got a well that has reached its economic life's limit, it really is time to plug it. And that's what the companies that I've been associated, or a company that I've been associated with, would try to do.
I know, the reason I ask is I know a guy who was given some oil well shares that were worthless at the time. He was a lawyer practicing law, and the client couldn't pay him, and so said, all I got for you is these old oil shares. And the next thing he knows, a few years later, the dividend checks started coming in, the royalty checks or whatever that, and they weren't necessarily small. I mean, he did fairly well for quite a while, based on what had previously been worthless shares. I think this was down the southeastern part of the state, maybe West Texas. But the reason I go down this path is because I also have a friend down at the Biopark Society who's a wildlife biologist specializing in endangered plants. And there's a couple of critically endangered plants up there, the northwest corner of the state. And he just cringes every time he sees one of those vehicles with the big flags, so that you don't run into each other, running around in dunes and so forth, because he knows they're out there potentially in areas that are close to these areas where the last of these endangered plants live. And I can't help but wonder if closing and then reopening again later under different economic and technological circumstances doesn't increase the traffic overall that you otherwise would have had, and therefore have some negative impact on the land. I mean, I know a pad is about 3 acres to go out there and set it up and drill, and I guess directional drilling has shrunk the number of pads you need to create, which I guess is a good thing. But I'm just wondering if keeping them open longer doesn't potentially keep you from having to go back out there and do it all over again later. That's my question.
It's a complicated question. And of course, not knowing the specifics of your friend, exactly what had happened, especially if it was in the southeast part of the state or in Texas. What we have seen in the past, say, 10 or 15 years is the application of two very mature technologies in a nice, novel, and effective way. That is horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracture stimulation. We've applied those old technologies in a new way and have discovered that some of the reservoirs that were not economic in the past are now economic. And so perhaps your friend didn't necessarily have a well that was reopened, but perhaps he had a lease that had opportunities that either that operator or another operator developed using these old technologies kind of writ new. That's a good thing. And you're right, we tend to now put multiple wells on a single pad. I've been very, very involved in a lot of work in southeast New Mexico in creating drilling islands where you've got very, very limited impacts on the surface, which is great for everyone, really. So I think that the developments that we're seeing today are much more friendly to the surface. And I'm not exactly sure what the vehicles are that you're talking about running around. Perhaps those are seismic type vehicles. But I don't know that it would make a difference, quite frankly, if you shut in an old producing well and then brought it back on versus continuing to produce that well. I think this is probably something that's not related to that.
That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member Duval, do you have questions of Mr. Smitherman?
No questions. Thank you. Some of them have already been addressed. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Member Garcia?
Yes, thank you. I do have a couple of questions for Mr. Smitherman. Mr. Smitherman, I understand that there are many factors that come into play when a business makes a decision about whether to continue operating a well whether it be a gas well or an oil well. And I understand my background, I know more about the mining industry than I do the oil and gas industry. But I know in mining, commodity price played a probably the biggest role in determining operations of mine sites. I'm wondering, could you tell me, would you say the commodity price is the main factor in making a decision? And then I know there's many other factors that come into play when making a business decision about closing or continuing to operate. Would you say the commodity price was one of the most important factors in making a decision about operations?
I always try to be cautious when I use any of the S words, biggest, smallest. It is certainly an important factor. It's a very important factor. Production rate's an important factor. Other operating costs associated with the well are an important factor. You can have the same well or a well making the same oil and gas production rate, but vastly different water production rates. And so your operating costs are vastly different. So it is certainly one of the more important factors, yes.
Could you, since you're here, let me go ahead and ask you, could you name some of the other factors that come into play when you're making a decision about continuing to operate a well? I understand you not only have to comply with Environment Department regulations, there's OCD regulations, there's OSHA regulations, and then there's many other factors involved in making a decision. Could you walk through some of the other factors aside from commodity price? What are some of the other factors that come into play?
Certainly, and it won't be exhaustive, just off the top of my head, so I appreciate you asking for some of those factors. I've already mentioned some of them. Production rate is obviously important. Production decline. How quickly is this well declining in its production? How many years of remaining life under any particular commodity price scenario does it have? Is it holding acreage that is valuable? That's a very important piece. It may be worth holding on a little longer if you think you've got more development opportunities on the same lease. There may be perhaps sales consideration. Is this something that another company might value? So you may want to keep the well on production if that's attractive to a buyer. That would be good. I guess other risks, operational risks that are associated with the well. You may have a well that's producing along just fine, but it's got maybe an artificial lift system on it that may have some future capital expenditures or major maintenance expenditures that you expect. There's probably others, Ms. Garcia, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That's very informative. Thank you. That's all I have.
Certainly.
Thank you. Member Honkert.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Smitherman, for your responses to the other board members. It's been very helpful, at least in my mind, to think about these various factors. I do think this is one of the big issues we're going to have to deal with as a board is the lower production wells. So just one question. I mean, you talked about commodity price, and obviously that would be a major consideration for making decisions, I would think. But I assume it's not only the current commodity price, but your expectation of whether that's going to go up and down, up or down in the next year or so would factor in, would it not?
That's correct. It's not only today's price, but it's tomorrow's price and the price over the next year or so. And then you get into the complications of whether or not you can, in essence, hedge those prices and whether that's a valuable or advisable thing to do. It gets complicated pretty quickly when you start thinking about that. But you're right, it's not just what we expect today, but it's what we expect within a reasonable future of that well's production.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have.
Certainly. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Member Hunker. I have a question from the chat. Nick McClellan asks, Mr. Smitherman, mechanically speaking, would adding new equipment to low-rate producing well further lowering production by adding back pressure, which would further extend the amount of time required to pay back the compliance costs?
As I understand that question, the answer is yes.
Thank you. I see Mr. Nightkeel on the screen. Mr. Nightkeel, you have questions of Mr. Smitherman?
Yeah, just briefly. Mr. Smitherman, my name's Matt Nightkeel. I'm here on behalf of Wild Earth Guardians. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
You were talking about making sort of the process of making a business decision around costs for marginal or stripper wells. And I was wondering if there's a marginal or stripper well that is externalizing a cost that is borne by the public or the state, do you think that that company should internalize that cost?
As I understand your question, I think that we, if you will, internalize those type of costs through regulations that are imposed on the business. So we, in essence, can quantify and quantify those costs and then make a rational decision based on those.
Okay, that's helpful. And so if there were a cost that has been externalized that's quantifiable, do you think that regulation would be helpful to internalize that cost to the company that creates it?
I think that to the degree that regulatory agencies recognize valid, I'll call them external costs, because I think that that's what I think we're saying the same thing. Then, in essence, those regulatory bodies will promulgate rules, and those companies will then comply with those rules, regardless, in essence, regardless of the cost.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis, I understand you have a follow-up.
Yes, I do. Just a quick one. Mr. Smitherman, based on your experience in the oil and gas industry and with NMOGA, would you estimate with the current rule this portion of the rule that we're looking at, the small business definition, the smaller companies that are operating largely marginal or stripper wells or low producers, whichever definition you want to use, do you see them going away? Like I'm wondering more about the shift in the company demographics as we kind of move forward with this definition. Will we see these smaller companies either sell out or kind of die off? Do you have an estimation on that, or is that kind of too big of a question to ask?
Thank you for the question. I think it's an important question to ask. I don't know, we certainly haven't quantified that, but anecdotally, I've got friends that are in business in Texas and New Mexico and Colorado and Louisiana, and I hear I hear those owners or those companies basically making decisions as to whether to continue doing business in a particular state partly based on the difficulty in the cost of compliance with regulations. I know our company, for example, basically didn't want to take any more opportunities in one state, not New Mexico, because of the difficulties in that particular state. So companies do make decisions that way. The harder it is, the more complicated it is, the more expensive it is to comply, does make it more difficult, especially for smaller companies that aren't necessarily as sophisticated, don't have the sophisticated persons on staff to be able to manage those difficulties.
Okay, and just for the rest of the board's benefit, what I was thinking of here is when I started out my career, I started out working for a small independent oil and gas company, and I've seen them kind of slowly going away, and I would, that's kind of what sticks out in my head right now is, are we going to see small businesses, small New Mexico owned companies starting to either dry up or sell out to bigger companies? And that's kind of where I was going with that question. So you, Mr. Smitherman, for taking the time to answer that for me.
I think that it's a worthy consideration and a worthy fear, if you will. I'm not sure selling out to bigger companies is really the alternative. When you get to the point where so many of your wells cannot no longer stand the cost of compliance, there really won't be a buyer. So maybe drying up and going away is a better way to expect the end of those companies to be.
All right. Thank you. I'll pause for a moment in the event other board members have follow-up questions. No? Mr. Heiser, do you have any follow-up redirect?
I do, Madam Hearing Officer, but I think fairly short and to respond to a couple of questions that came up during this round. Mr. Smitherman, with respect to, I think, Vice Chair Trujillo Davis's really good question, another way that you could look at it would be that over your time as an industry executive, have you found that the compliance staff that a company has to have, whether they're a small or large operator, has increased in size as the regulatory environment has become more involved?
There's no doubt about that. Our company grew in their regulatory compliance staff, and I know that that's ubiquitous across the industry.
And does the cost of that compliance staff then have to be spread over all the operating assets of the company?
It does.
Okay. And then Mr. Nakil asked you a good question about internalization of externalities and the role that regulation can play in that. Is there a scope challenge there, which is that if the externalities are imposed in only one area, say New Mexico, but they're not imposed in other areas, say Texas or Colorado, what does that do to the industry's incentives? And does that really change things, or does it just cause shifts?
Well, it certainly causes shifts. As I mentioned, our company stopped doing as much business in one state and started doing more business in others because of the complications of compliance in that state. So it tends to, businesses try to make rational decisions, and it's a very rational decision to move more of your capital dollars and development dollars into places where your compliance is easier and where your costs are lower.
And then back to a very initial question from Chair Sweeney, where she asked what was some of the challenges that NMOGA had with the small business exemption as the Environment Department had put it forward in the September rules. Was one of the challenges that NMOGA represents a lot of members, but we weren't able to really identify a member that met both the number of employee criteria and the revenue criteria, and that was part of the challenge we were having.
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right. If there is nothing further, we will excuse Mr. Smitherman for now. Ms. Katz, I'm sorry, I see you on screen. Do you have something further?
Madam Hearing Officer, there was quite a lot of additional testimony that was presented, and I would like to ask if I could put on one of my witnesses to do some rebuttal to that testimony.
Yes, certainly. So, but you don't have any further questions of Mr. Smitherman?
No, I do not. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Kolkalisher, I see you on the screen. Did you have further questions of Mr. Smitherman?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, I do have some cross-examination questions if now's an appropriate time.
All right, yes, I think it is. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Smitherman, you had some questions about whether stripper wells impose external costs. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
Would you agree that stripper wells and other oil and gas wells also produce external benefits in addition to producing external costs?
Absolutely.
Would you agree that the oil and gas produced by these wells provides electricity to all Americans and people living in New Mexico?
It does.
Would you agree that oil and gas provides transportation fuel?
It does.
Does it also allow people?
Objection. Irrelevant.
Ms. Fox? So,
Objection irrelevant. This, this testimony had to do with the small business exemption, and we've gone far afield of that for an exemption for language that neither NMOGA or the independents are even proposing for change. And it's also unusual that we would have allow counsel from the other parties 2 opportunities for cross-examination. And so after board members. So that's another objection.
all right, thank you. We're getting used to this new method of cross-examination, and Mr. Kolklisher had asked earlier. But Mr. Kolklisher, I remember Mr. Nykiel's question, Mr. Smitherman, but I'm wondering if we have gone far afield at this point.
Madam Hearing Officer, I believe it is relevant because the implication earlier was that in evaluating the criteria for small businesses, the external cost of these wells should be included. And if the external cost should be included, I'd like to draw a testimony from this witness about the external benefits that could also be included for this provision.
All right, so thank
Madam
you.
Hearing Officer?
Yes.
May I just, I'm a little confused. I believe we didn't, I don't know what we provided for as far as friendly cross. I don't think we had said that that was automatically allowed.
We hadn't, and mostly what I was thinking is that because Mr. Kolklisher had passed earlier on the opportunity to ask questions, I would give him an opportunity now, even if it were out of order. Again, though, so thank you, Ms. Katz, and thank you, Ms. Fox. I certainly take your point. Having said that, Mr. Nykiel did ask the question he asked. So Mr. Kolklisher, if you would please very quickly do this and do it briefly.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. Smitherman, would you agree that if the external costs of a stripper well are to be included or considered in any evaluation of the regulatory definition or exceptions for small businesses, that it would also be appropriate to include the external benefits provided by those wells?
Yes, I do.
I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kolklisher. If there's nothing further, we'll excuse Mr. Smitherman for the moment. And
thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you very much. Ms. Katz, you said you have some brief rebuttal. to Mr. Smitherman's testimony. Would you like to do that now while the topic is fresh in our minds?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, thank you. And I would call Elizabeth Bisbee Keene on that point.
All right, and I did make her a panelist. Does she need screen sharing privilege?
No, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right.
Thank you.
Ms. Keene is still under oath, and to the extent she'll be referring to exhibits, please let us know that ahead of time.
Thank you. I don't believe we'll be referring to any specific exhibits, just maybe other testimony. Ms. Keene, is it your understanding that NMOGA and IPA&M are advocating for an exemption for stripper wells and low producing wells, I should say? In the information that was presented by Mr. Powell regarding the wells in New Mexico, how many stripper wells were identified by the Oil Conservation Division?
I will reference Mr. Powell's rebuttal exhibit 17 for the board, and there were 30,021 total stripper wells.
And how many marginal wells were identified by OCD?
8,132.
And what is the percentage of production from stripper wells and marginal wells?
The total share of production from stripper gas wells is 19.7% of total gas production in the state. And the percentage of production from oil stripper wells is 10% of total production in the state. The percentage of production, I'm sorry, the percentage of production from marginal oil wells is 28.4% of total production. And the percentage of total production from gas marginal wells is 7.3% of total production.
Do you know the lifetime of a typical oil or gas well?
So our records indicate that we have wells in existence since the early 1970s. And we have decades, we have wells that have been in production for decades in our records.
And can low producing wells operate for long periods of time?
Yes, as indicated by the data and the lifetime of the well that we have data on.
Do low producing wells necessarily have low emissions?
They typically have lower emissions than higher production facilities, but they do have emissions.
And for instance, a low producing oil well still have high VOC emissions because the focus is on oil production, not gas production?
It could, yes.
Do you know the average emission rate of one of these types of wells?
So we've estimated an average emission rate of around 8 tons to 10 tons per year for a stripper well, which has a very specific definition in OCD's regulation. The definition of a stripper well, again, is a well that produces a daily average of less than 10 barrels of oil per day or 60,000 cubic feet of natural gas per day.
And so as far as the average emission rate for one of those types of wells in the aggregate, what would that equate to as a total amount of emissions?
It would be several, many thousands of tons, if not hundreds of thousands of tons of VOC and NOx emissions.
Do you think, and does the department believe that all companies should be able to comply with minimum requirements such as best management and operational practices, calculating their potential to emit, and repairing leaks if they want to be able to operate in this state?
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Katz and Ms. Keen. I'll pause for a moment for council to present themselves on screen. I see Mr. Bach. Mr. Bach.
Yeah, Madam Hearing Officer, just a couple questions for the witness. Miss Bisbee-Keen, is New Mexico the first state to adopt a ozone precursor rule for the oil and gas sector?
No, it's not.
In fact, states like Colorado, Pennsylvania have been doing this for years, right?
Yes, they have.
Is there any evidence that anyone submitted in the record of massive well shut-ins for example, in Colorado as a result of their regulation?
Not that I'm aware of.
Or any other jurisdiction where this has been done?
Not that I have knowledge of.
So would it be fair to say that some of this may be more speculation, but that when the rubber hits the road, as it were, companies usually seem to be able to comply with the regulations? I'm sorry, that may be that may be more argument than anything. But anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you. Anyone else like to join us on screen for questions of Ms. Keen? No. I'm going to, oh, there's Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose.
Just one follow-up question, hopefully just one, we'll see. Ms. Bisbee-Keen, in terms of the emissions you spoke about, do you know whether the modeling analysis that was done by Ramboll considered or used as an option inclusion of the emissions from those wells or not in terms of the impact on ambient ozone concentrations?
Those upstream oil and gas wells were included in the modeling inventory.
And as I understand your proposal on the small business exemption, that the LDAR program would still be applicable to those wells, even if they were a small business under your proposal, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so that the operators would still be required to investigate and correct leaks if they were to occur. So it's not a complete exemption. It's an exemption from certain requirements under the proposal.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Okay, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Pause another moment. In the event there are other questions by council or party representatives? No? So I'll turn to the board for their questions. While I'm doing that, if you are an attendee rather than a panelist on this proceeding and you would have a question, please reach out in the chat. Madam Chair, do you have questions?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I do not.
All right, thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Ms. Keen, I was curious, and I think Mr. Rose kind of started asking these questions, but the small business designation doesn't exempt an operator from the rules, do they? I just want to clarify. I'm looking at the rule here. Is that what I'm understanding, that they're not exempt from everything, just some things?
That's correct, Member Davis. There's a tiered set of requirements for all operators, and all operators are required to calculate their potential to emit and have that calculation certified. All operators are required to comply with the leak detection and repair requirements. And then there are other specific record keeping requirements and operational requirements for small business facilities. But a qualifying small business facility only needs to meet the requirements that are in section 125.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that we weren't talking about no requirements. Okay, great. Thank you for clearing that up for me.
Thank you. Member Cates, do you have questions?
No questions here, thank you.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
No questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Duval? May have stepped away. Member Garcia?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I just have one clarifying question for Ms. Keene. Also, my understanding is this rule, we're talking about certain counties that it applies to, correct? So we're not talking about the entire universe of oil and gas wells, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and we're talking about 7 counties, roughly.
Eight counties, Member
8
Garcia?
counties.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Member Honker?
Just one question. Will there be additional discussion of Colorado and Pennsylvania requirements as we get into specific portions of the rule?
Yes, Member Hunker.
Okay, that's thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. Ms. Katz, will there be any follow-up?
I guess just one quick question. So I just wanted to make clear that NMED is proposing the small business definition, but that NMOGA and IPA and M are wanting to go back to a full exemption for stripper wells. Is that correct?
That's right.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Ms. Katz. If there's nothing further, we will excuse Ms. Keene for the moment. Do I understand at this point that we will be turning to Ms. Paraños and EDF's witness, Dr. Thompson? Ms. Paraños, I see you on screen.
Good morning, Madam Hearing Officer. Let me just change my video. It's the wrong camera.
And it might be appropriate to take a short break at this time. I wasn't necessarily suggesting we tackle Dr. Thompson's testimony without a break. I just wanted to make sure I was correct about where we were going. All right. So shall we take 15 minutes? Come back at 10:48 or so? Yeah. All right. Thank you.